Hello, everybody. It's the Lawn Gnome, and welcome to another episode of Sunday Sit-Downs, the show where anything goes and nothing is left behind. As always, I'm Steve, your friendly neighborhood Lawn Gnome, and I'm really excited to start another season of Sunday Sit-Down here on my channel. And I know it's the last season. I know, and I'm going to explain a lot more as the year goes forward, but one of the few things I really wanted to do, especially being the last season of great discussions, of great topics with great YouTubers, I, of course, wanted to save some of the better conversations for last. And now is finally the time where I could have a Sunday sit-downs about the film series that has been some of the most hallowed, but then again, these days, maybe not so much, but that's why I really was wanting to wait till a specific movie had officially hit theaters and I saw it. And of course, the topic today is Star Wars. And I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation because this is not going to be about fanboy gushing. This is going to be a very interesting, broad conversation because I've said this in my videos, everybody. I used to think that Star Wars was sort of some of the greatest films of all time. But being the film appreciator that I have grown to be, I mean, right before I got together with my guest today, who is Bryan Lomax from Bryan Lomax Movie Talk. Bryan, it's great to have you back. Thank you for coming once again.
It's okay. Good to be here.
Yeah, so I just watched Memoirs of a Geisha before I started recording this video with Bryan. And basically, I have definitely seen my tastes change. And right now, one of the best movies that I have seen so far this year is the Sam Mendes film 1917.
Oh,
so
absolutely.
Star Wars has become something not so glamorous anymore, but still its legacy is something that needs to be preserved because it pretty much has revolutionized the way we go to the movies. And we can see all different kinds of movies, and it's not just for the sake of seeing those movies, because what Star Wars gave us was the film-going experience, the reason why we go to the theater, see these grand stories on the big screen. Star Wars was one that just made it bigger and better. And I'm sure that, Bryan, you can agree with that statement.
Yeah, I can to a degree. You know, like, let's not pretend that Star Wars invented the summer blockbuster. You know, we had Jaws in 1975. We had epics like Ben-Hur and whatnot way before that. That and you look at from a financial perspective, even films like Gone with the Wind. That being Depression era and whatnot. Just because of that time period and stuff and no TV and things like that. If you look at inflation, I think Gone with the Wind is still like right up there,
Yeah.
So yeah, but yeah, obviously the by that point the big blockbuster kind of attitude started to settle in, and yeah, Lucas, he absolutely cottoned on to something that other people weren't doing at the time. He took a load of ideas that we had seen in a lot of other things before, like the 1930s serials, Flash Gordon, things like that. But he put it on a much bigger canvas, created these worlds that we could only dream about or read about, and he put them on screen. And that's no mean feat, given the time in which it was done. So I've always respected Star Wars, but I've never been, like, just talking about the original trilogy here, I've never been the Star Wars guy. I've never been fanatical or religious about it, because I do think that there are a lot of fans, Star Wars fans, that they're not just fans, they're fanatics, and there is a bit of a difference.
I agree.
And it's just like, yeah, so I guess I just think that I recognize the legacy of the films, that what they did for cinema, but I will say up front, I won't be gushing over them as much as a lot of people might expect me to.
Well, I wasn't expecting that, to be honest with you, but I agree with what you said a little bit earlier. George Lucas was part of this new wave of movie makers at that time because he was coming into the business with names like Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg. He wasn't just one of those guys that changed the film industry in the 1970s because it was pretty much that whole collective group that did that. But like you said, there had not been any kinds of films that really took the concept of science fiction and fantasy and gave it to us the way that he did. Spielberg had not even made Close Encounters of the Third Kind just yet. So it was also a staple because this was when we got into the 1980s. That was when movies were starting to get extremely creative because of this first group of directors that showed us we can make the impossible possible on the big screen. And that's when you get the ETs of the world, the Ghostbusters of the world, Back to the Future, all of these crazy creative films. It was pretty much George Lucas and these other great names that got it started. And speaking of getting things started, I'd like to begin at the beginning. And my question to you first, as always, is your first introduction to Star Wars. You know, how old were you? What was the first film that you saw? And what were your first impressions of it?
I wouldn't actually be able to tell you what the first one I saw was, but my early memories of Star Wars was always they were always on around Christmas time. It was like Superman 1 and 2. The original Star Wars trilogy and those first two Superman films, when I was a kid, from about the age of 5 up to the age of 10, they were just always on at Christmas. For whatever reason, they seem to get pulled as we hit 89 or the 90s. And obviously there was plans afoot by Lucas to re-release them and stuff, which we didn't know about at the time. But certainly when I was a kid, they just always seemed to be on around holiday season. But the thing is, for me, like, as a child, they always bled into each other. Mm-hmm. So if you'd have asked me as a kid, the moment where Vader tells Luke that he's his father, which one is that from? I wouldn't have been able to tell you because they all bled into each other.
That's true.
And I always remember as a kid, a lot of the scenes I loved most came from Return of the Jedi. Like my favorite sequence was always the stuff on the ship with the Emperor manipulating Luke and Vader, and just that whole sequence, minus the Ewoks getting sandwiched in between. But there'd be a Star Wars film on the TV, and me as a 5-6-year-old boy, I would be waiting for that sequence, and then it wouldn't come on. And it'd be like, I didn't know why it didn't come on that time, and it did other times, and it's just that for me is what Star Wars was as a kid. I didn't really get caught up in the story. I just that grabbed me. And I would be present for those moments mentally. And then for the rest of it, I would kind of zone out and not really know what was going on. Especially if you don't watch it in chronological order and you end up kind of halfway through Empire or whatever. But I think what kept me watching, in spite of the fact that I didn't know what was going on, was that world building, was that
right.
being taken away to a galaxy far, far away, with all these different crazy aliens and crazy characters and worlds we've never seen before. And I was happy to be there.
Right.
But that's kind of all Star Wars was to me as a kid. And I didn't really understand the religious kind of following behind it. And teenage years, I revisited them, and then that's when I started to pay attention to the story. But yeah, certainly as a child, not so much. Like I say, as a child, my experience with Star Wars is there are key sequences throughout the trilogy that I always remembered, always really liked, but the films never really grabbed me from a narrative standpoint. You know, I couldn't have told you which one was which.
Well, it's definitely a different story from me because I actually encountered Star Wars in my youth 2 times, and I didn't even know what Star Wars was. And it wasn't until I was going on the age of 10 when I finally watched the very first Star Wars movie. And even that is an interesting story on its own. So I'm going to try and not necessarily do it in chronological order, but try and make it all flow perfectly. So basically, I went to Disney World in Florida with my parents, and one of the rides that I wanted to go on was Star Tours. Now, I didn't know that Star Tours had anything to do with Star Wars, also because of the fact that my parents are not Star Wars fans. They don't care much for those movies. So they didn't really care about exposing me to those movies. Not that they were thinking that they were bad movies, they just weren't their thing. Like, if my dad had the ability, he would have sat me in front of a James Bond movie when I was 4 years old, but he waited a little bit till I got older to understand them. But so I went on Star Tours so many times when we were down in Florida and had a blast. And then a few months later, I go to a video store that officially ages me right there to rent a movie. And the movie that I wanted to rent was Three Ninjas, which is a stupid little kiddie movie because I saw it on the big screen and loved it. And the video store didn't have it. And I threw a tantrum in the video store. And my mom sees a copy of Star Wars on the shelf, and she's basically saying, he liked that ride in Disney World. Maybe he'll actually like the movie. And she goes, do you remember that Star Tours ride that you went on in Florida? And I was like, yeah. And she goes, well, this is the movie that it's based on. Why don't you watch Star Wars? So I watched Star Wars. And the first thing that I notice in Star Wars is C-3PO and R2-D2, the first two characters that start talking. I'm like, wait a minute. I remember those two guys from Sesame Street when I was 3. So basically, I had known about Star Wars, but technically didn't know what Star Wars was when I was very, very little. Because yes, C-3PO and R2-D2 did make appearances on Sesame Street when I was growing up. So I thought it was really funny how that all sort of bled together. So the first Star Wars movie, you know, I had a good time with it. You know, I was old enough to appreciate it. But I really wasn't told much after that. Like, nobody was telling me, you know, that there's more Star Wars. And I was like, oh, well, you know, it's sort of like happened as I got a little bit more into it and friends started showing me all that stuff. So now let's move into question 2, because it fits in with the next idea, which is, you know, what was your initial reaction when you saw that infamous and iconic moment that pretty much now goes down into like movie history, which is, you know, I am your father? You know, just in case everybody has not seen Empire Strikes Back, you know, you had 40 years to do so, so there's no excuses anymore. So don't mind us if we start talking about some of these movies in depth. So when you first saw that moment, what was your takeaway from it?
Honestly, all the Star Wars fanatics are going to curse me out now, but it had no impact on me whatsoever.
That makes 2 of us. I'm going to let you guys, I'm going to let that happen right now, but then I'll get my share.
I just, like I say, I was such a casual viewer, a passive viewer almost of these films as a child, that by the time that moment even had any kind of weight, it was only because I had been told by so many different movie magazines and shows that it does have weight, you know. So it's like I never experienced it from that angle, which, you know, if you're a Star Wars fan that was around at the time and you were following the story, you were hooked into the story, and then that moment happens and you're like, your mind is blown.
Yeah.
I was never a guy because I never followed those movies to such a degree where, where this moment would have such an impact. So
Right.
I'd obviously seen that moment a few times over the course of many years, Christmas times, it being on. It just didn't make an impact on me.
Well, funny enough, on my end, the next Star Wars movie that I watched was actually Return of the Jedi. So I completely skipped over The Empire Strikes Back
Oh man.
when I first saw it, and I'm like just looking at that scene at the very end where Luke starts calling him father. I'm like, I don't understand what's happening here. And funny enough, my uncle, technically not my uncle, but he's old enough to be my uncle, but my dad's first cousin, who's someone who's very close with my family, he was a Star Wars fan. Not a Star Wars fanatic, but a true fan. He had all the movies, get ready for this, on Laserdisc. So now we're going way back into technology. And he started to explain it a little bit more to me at that time. I was now officially like somewhere between 11 and maybe even going on 12. And he told me the whole thing about, Luke Skywalker's father is Darth Vader. Luke got his hand cut off. And honestly, Bryan, I'll tell you, I first watched the entire trilogy with true appreciation for the story when I bought the original Star Wars trilogy box set in 1995. So I was going into high school. Yeah. So that was when I was really starting to get an understanding. And yes, I agree. I already knew about the whole story. When you see it it's very impactful from an acting standpoint and really moving the story along because it is, a crazy twist. Mm-hmm. I actually joke around with my wife saying, if The Empire Strikes Back came out now with the internet the way it is now, I don't think that this moment would have been so impactful because somebody would have leaked it some way, somehow, and the whole thing would have been ruined. These movies probably would just be dust in the wind at the end of it if it all came out now, But it's just amazing how people were able to keep it hidden for so long. I mean, I find it really funny how, just recently on the CW with the Arrowverse, this whole thing with Crisis on Infinite Earths, the fact that they actually had the Grant Gustin TV Flash meet the Ezra Miller movie Flash, and the fact that they actually were able to
on YouTube.
They were able to actually keep it hidden until it aired. Even some of those cast members didn't even know that that was happening. But, that just shows you that it's a whole different world in terms of movie making. And these specific movies are what they are only because they were the product of the time that they were in. That's just the way that I look at it. But yeah, I'm with you. I didn't really feel so impacted. It got me more interested in the story. It made me want to see the story from episodes 4 to 6. I owned them. The special editions came out in the theaters, and I went to go see all 3 Star Wars movies on the big screen because people always say, oh, if only you were able to have seen them on the big screen, when I was a little kid, because they told me the stories of the lines around the block and like how it was so hard to get a ticket. And knowing that I had that opportunity to see them in theaters, I had to take advantage of the special editions. And yeah, I think seeing them on the big screen creates a lot more of an impact just for a movie watcher or a movie fan, not necessarily a Star Wars fan, but just someone who appreciates going to a movie theater and seeing those movies. I think that Star Wars really is made for the big screen.
Can you remember what year it was those special editions were released?
Yes, I can. I believe they were 1997 for the 20th anniversary of the first film.
Right. Okay, so I'm just getting the timeline right in my head. So I think I was about 15 when I sat down and watched the whole trilogy for the first time as a by that point genuine bona fide film fanatic. because it was from about the age of 11, 12 that's when I really started getting into film in a big way, not just a casual way. And then, yeah, by 15, 16, I was all about movies. And a friend of mine, Matt Brewer, he was a nut on Star Wars. He loved Star Wars, and I went round to his house, and over I can't remember. In fact, I think we watched Star Wars Episode 4 at his, and then he let me take Empire and Jedi away with me because he had the video box set, and I took those two away and I watched them at home. And I remember. So this is my experience of taking in the story for the first time. As a child, obviously, everything just bled into each other, didn't really pay much attention, got bored several times. This is the first time, so 15 years old, watching it with my mate. I've got to say, Star Wars had some issues for me, but there was enough there to make me want to watch the sequels. And then when I watched Empire, I took that home, I watched Empire, I thought that was on a completely different level.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's funny, because when I finally got to watch the trilogy as a whole, the one movie that I literally wanted to watch over and over and over again was Empire. And I think it's just because of the fact that, I don't know what it is, but people just get drawn to darkness, like peril, moments where your heroes are backed into a corner and you wonder, how are they going to get out of this,
I just think it's the way it's handled. I mean, it was Irving Kershner who did Empire.
That's correct.
And I just think there's no better way to say it. He's a better director than Lucas. I don't think Lucas is a storyteller. I think he's a world builder, and he is a pioneer of film technology. I think he brings those two elements together. But when he's in control of the story, complete control, when he's in the director's chair, I don't think he can get the emotional beats. I don't think he's very good at it. And I still feel that way now. Episode 4, there's so many scenes in that film that should be, I mean, you talk about darkness as if it only came in Empire, as if Empire is when it gets dark. No, it isn't. On paper, Episode 4 is seriously dark.
Of course it is.
She sees her homeworld destroyed. Luke sees his uncle and his aunt burnt to a crisp. And then at the end of the film, he sees his hero, his mentor, struck down by Vader. It's a dark film. And I think if Irving Kershner had been directing that film, we would have felt the impact of those choices, of those actions from the characters.
Yeah, I think it's because the fantasy elements of that specific film overshadow those true dark moments. That's what I think it really is. And that's where I will agree yet slightly disagree. I think that George Lucas is a good person when it comes to world building, but also he knows how to put a good story together. However, once that story has been created, everything else, from the character mannerisms to the dialogue, that's where he has to stop and another person needs to come in and take over. That's what I think about George Lucas.
Yeah, no, we agree. I mean, by storyteller, what I mean is he is a great storyteller in the sense that he knows how to build a world and he knows about plotting. He knows how to plot the arc of a complete story. But storytelling, when you're talking about film, is about more than that. It's how do you deal with actors? How do you draw those emotional beats out of the performances? That's where the director steps up to the plate. And Lucas just does not have that at all. And I always get the sense when I'm watching stuff he's directed that it's like he gets the actors to say the lines that he's written, and once he's got it, that's it.
Right.
He's missing that magic, you know, that someone
Yeah.
like Spielberg, like Coppola, like Scorsese would pick up on, and not only pick up on, but search for until they got it. And I just don't feel like Lucas is that man. So that to me is the real reason why Empire is the clear standout from that original trilogy, because it has a director who knows that stuff, who knows how to do that stuff. So yeah, 15 years old, I'm watching these films on video. Empire, I absolutely loved watching it at that time, and it got me really excited for Jedi,
Mm-hmm.
because Jedi was the one that had all the bits in it that I remembered as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all the stuff like Boba Fett and like the pit, the sand pit, the stuff on the bridge at the end with the Emperor, all of that stuff. I thought, you know, that's the stuff that stuck in my head. So if Empire is this good, how awesome is Jedi going to be? And unfortunately,
It takes a dive.
it does take a dive. I do still prefer it to Episode 4, but I just think there's a lot of elements in it that bog it down. Ewoks, hello, you know,
It's
things like that. I
it
feel
brings
like,
back more of the fantasy and a little bit more family oriented stuff. The Ewoks bring the children to the story.
yeah, and I just feel like he's cramming too much in at this point. So when we do get to the climactic stuff on the bridge with the Emperor, that's the stuff I want to stay with. And every time we pull away from it, I lose interest.
Right.
But it's still a solid film. It's still got some really great action set pieces in it, and it does have some reasonably well handled emotional beats. But for
Right.
me, original trilogy at that point, 15 years old, you know, I was like, I get it. I get why people were so religious about it. You know, I can imagine being a young adult in the 70s and going along with this story, seeing all this plotting, particularly Empire Strikes Back, and being really, yeah, just transported to a completely different galaxy.
Right.
And obviously a couple of years after that, the reissues came out with the redone special effects and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I went to see those at the cinema.
Yeah.
I, I I thought they were still good, but
Yeah. They were
just
fun.
totally unnecessary in many ways. The way, you
Well,
know, they change stuff, but
I don't know about the whole. Well, honestly, I mean, I like it when they try to enhance the effects because,
yeah,
George Lucas definitely wanted to improve on things that he knew he could do better because that's the one thing. He is a visionary when it comes to his world building. So the fact that he actually was going to let the technology catch up with the time, there were certain things that I didn't think were necessary, but the fact that he was able to actually give us the Wampa in Empire Strikes Back, the fact that he was able to pull back and show us more of some of these amazing planets, like to actually see the entire city of Mos Eisley and what's going on there. They're not plot drivers, but it's just something cool to see because he wants to give you that grand world. So, of course, at this time, also another thing I didn't mention, before I really started to get into Star Wars, I was into Star Trek. That was my jam.
mm,
But then as a teenager, I'm starting to really just love the full-on fantasy and the crazy world building and just the epicness that Star Wars had to offer. So of course, one of the few things that I got very, very excited for, because the original trilogy, when it came out on VHS, also once again, aging myself, I get those little interviews that George Lucas had with Leonard Maltin. And Leonard Maltin, at the very end of the review on Return of the Jedi, is asking, let's talk about the next 3 films. And I'm like, what do you mean the next 3 films? And it's kind of funny because the fact that George Lucas gave us 4, 5, and 6 first, I think that was actually a stroke of genius because people were in such demand for the backstory. People really wanted to see Anakin Skywalker become Darth Vader. And that will lead into the next question, which is your possible, if any, anticipation for the prequels And what was your experience when you saw episode 1? Because I'm pretty sure at this time you did get excited for episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and I'm pretty sure you went to go see it in theaters as soon as you could.
Yeah, there was another little film out that year that kind of took the wind out of its sails. That little film was called The Matrix, and
And that ended up being the better film. It did.
I remember a lot of excitement surrounding Star Wars. I remember this is it. This is the year. It was all on magazines. Darth Maul was everywhere. This was going to be the big villain. This was going to be the new Vader.
The hype was there, man. The hype was definitely there.
All the images of Darth Maul just plaguing everything. Toys, his double lightsaber on show all the time. And then before that comes out, this little film called The Matrix comes out that I hear about. The first thing I saw of that was like a 5-star review in Empire magazine. I'm like, what? With Keanu Reeves? 5 stars? Really? And then all of a sudden, boom, everyone's talking about The Matrix. And then and suddenly the hype's just dying for Star Wars, because everyone's so caught up in this Matrix kind of vibe, and it's just blowing everyone's minds. And then, so by the time Star Wars comes along, for me anyway, obviously not for the big Star Wars fans, but for me, Star Wars then just kind of trickled into the screen for me, because I was still buzzing from The Matrix. I wanted to see more of them. But I'm like, it's Star Wars. It's going to be big. It's going to be huge. And with the advancements in technology and stuff, it's going to be better. It's just, wow, what he did in the 70s and the 80s. Imagine what he can do now. So I'll go and see it. And man alive. Oh man, I came out of that film and I was like, did Empire really happen? Was Empire Strikes Back just was it a fluke or what? Because I remember as well, Empire magazine once again, they gave it was it a 4-star review or maybe even a 5-star review? I think.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
It was at least a 4-star review. It was something they came to regret very, very quickly. I mean, back then, Empire was like my movie Bible. I would just, I bought it religiously, and yeah. But yeah, what do you say? It just felt so lightweight, and Jar Jar Binks, man alive, just to make this decision to put the most irritating character of the entire series in so many scenes, like he's there in like 50% of the movie, just doing nothing, just assing around.
Comic relief.
Yeah, and you're just like, just get on with the story. We want. This is about Anakin. We want to see how Anakin becomes Vader. Stop messing around with all this nonsense. And then the stuff with Darth Maul, this character that had been bigged up so much, was on the front covers of everything, and like set up as the new big bad. He's in like what, 3 scenes? One of them obviously a big fight scene at the end, but it's just like that's essentially it. He comes in and he has a fight, kills a dude that. Yeah, it's just. I remember reading like a couple of years later, or a few years later, when it was just before the release of Revenge of the Sith, and I would have read this either a total film, I can't remember which, but it was an interview with George Lucas, and he admitted at this point, just before the release of Revenge of the Sith, that this is the story he wanted to tell, Revenge of the Sith, essentially. So when he had the prequels in mind, 75% of the story he wanted to tell is all in. 25%, the other 25% was in Attack of the Clones, which is basically him admitting that Phantom Menace is filler. It is all filler, essentially, to make it a trilogy, because we had the original trilogy. Now we have to have these prequels, and it's got to be a trilogy. But he didn't have enough story. He just didn't. So instead of doing something that really should have been 2 films, he forced this trilogy. And what we get is Phantom Menace kicking it off, in which there is zero of the story he genuinely wanted to tell in it. It's just, and it shows. You feel it. It's terrible.
Well, you know, I'm not going to say that you're wrong, because there is a great deal of stuff in there that is just, well, one of the few things that I will say when it comes to especially the first 2 movies in the prequels is, once again, this is just showing you that he can make a good story, but he shouldn't be directing the actors, and he shouldn't be, in the director's chair, because honestly, when I left Phantom Menace, I actually just was gushing about it because I had a good time. I loved the Duel of the Fates lightsaber scene. I loved the pod race. I loved all the little space battles and all the new creatures, and just always saying to myself that when it comes to a massive story, the first part is always the one that people are going to have the most issues with, merely because of the fact that it's a starting point. You're building your world, you're creating and introducing your characters. But, something, at this point in time, I actually have seen The Phantom Menace in theaters more than any of the other Star Wars films. I went to see this movie 3 times in theaters when it came out, just because of being in that theater and watching all these things on a massive screen was just so cool. And then when they unfortunately stopped doing this, because we'll get to this whole thing with Disney and whatnot, but at one point they were releasing all the films in 3D. So of course the Phantom Menace comes out first, and I go to see that movie in 3D, and that was my 4th time. But I just think that the thing about the Phantom Menace is it's not perfect, but it's still a lot of fun. There's just a lot of fun to be had in there. And because of the fact that Anakin is a child in this, you want to bring a little bit more of that child/family-friendly nature in there. But no, when Natalie Portman opens her mouth in that movie, you just want to tear your face off, because the dialogue is absolutely dreadful. When you watch Attack of the Clones and you see the love story, that love story that you knew was important, not even William Shakespeare himself could save the way that was written for that movie. But at the same time, you want to go see what happens with the Clone Wars and the introduction to that. And you want to see, the other thing that I'm pretty sure he had no plans to do so was to throw in Boba Fett's origin story in Attack of the Clones, And let's get a little further on into that with question 4. With the completion at the time with all 6 of these films, how did you feel about the prequels as a whole? Like, did they find their proper place after they were officially done with? And we can go a little bit more into each of the individual films if you'd like.
Well, for me, they solidified the idea that I already had in my head, which is that it was always a little bit overhyped. People had such a love for this thing that, it was good, but is it really that good? I just, you can't say that these days without people assaulting you, And it's just,
I know.
But it's like, the original Star Wars trilogy is good. It's good, but that's it for me, And it's like the Empire Strikes Back. That's like a 4.5 out of 5 for me. That's it's a 9 out of 10. But yeah, that's it. I mean, I prefer Revenge of the Sith over Episode 4 and Return of the Jedi. So from those first 6, I'd go Empire at the top, then Revenge of the Sith, then Return of the Jedi.
I gotta tell you, you have no idea how happy I am to hear what you just said, because I think that Revenge of the Sith is so much better than some people give it credit for. And, that was the completing piece of the entire saga at that time. That was really the movie that everybody was excited for. And one of the things, even though the first part of the film is nothing great, like this actually happened. I know that you're not allowed to cause a scene when you're watching a movie in public in the theaters, but that scene in Revenge of the Sith where Anakin is watching Padme comb her hair on the balcony, and he says, "No, it's because I'm so in love with you." I actually let out a loud ha, like in the middle of the theater, and actually got some people to laugh, not like yell at me or anything, but like it just showed me that George Lucas is a terrible director. But I gotta say, the man's got some serious balls when it came to putting that movie out, because it was the first Star Wars film to get the PG-13 rating. And personally, I think that it goes darker, especially during the scenes of Anakin's betrayal. I mean, I still remember going to see it with a whole bunch of friends, and that scene where he goes into the Jedi chamber with all the little Jedi students and he ignites his lightsaber, you don't see what happens, but you know what happens. Some of my friends actually cried. They couldn't, even though they knew that this was something that was going to happen for years, to actually see it unfold and watch the Jedi get defeated by the new Empire, it was gut-wrenching. And the fact that George Lucas didn't hold back, especially with an extremely powerful score from John Williams, in my opinion, one of his best in Star Wars. And then when you finally get to that climactic battle between Obi-Wan and Anakin on that lava planet Mustafar, I mean, I remember when I was in junior high school, 12, 13, and one of my friends who was a massive Star Wars fan, this was a guy who read the movies, watched the movies, read the books, even read a few of the comics. He was like saying, Anakin and Obi-Wan are fighting over a rock bridge over a lava pit. So I was like, when am I finally going to see that lava pit fight? So it wasn't exactly a rock bridge. It was a bunch of different kinds of terrains. But that scene when the battle is over, it's gut-wrenching. And I also have to say,
as he's sliding down and he's burning, it's pretty horrific.
Exactly. But
this
also
guy is being burnt alive, and it's just like, what the heck?
But
this is in a
but also I love how George Lucas literally closes up every little plot hole within the last 25 minutes of that film. It's like when Obi-Wan picks up Anakin's lightsaber as he's burning, everyone's like, oh, that's how he got the lightsaber! Like, everybody was loving all those little all those little holes that he was like easily filling. Like, how did Yoda get to Dagobah? There was actually a scene that was cut from the film where you actually see his pod land on Dagobah, and he looks around and is like, yeah, this is home. But the only issue that I had, along with that horrible dialogue in the beginning, is also that I felt that the ending of the film was a little rushed. Like the whole thing with the birth of the twins and the Jedi going into exile and just giving Luke to his uncle and aunt, I felt that they could have added like maybe an extra 15 minutes just to make it a little bit more impactful. Also with C-3PO getting his mind wiped, that was another thing. Like everybody was like, oh, so that's why he doesn't remember anybody, because he would have remembered Anakin. But and the funny thing is, when it was all complete, there were a couple of things that I even saw in the original trilogy, and I'm like saying to myself, did George Lucas really plan that? The scene where Chewie is getting his handcuffs put on him in Empire Strikes Back, and Boba Fett is about to shoot him, and Darth Vader puts his blaster down. Is it because of the fact that C-3PO is on Chewie's back And Darth Vader remembers the fact that he made him when he was a boy. I'm like, it got people thinking when you had that complete trilogy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think a lot of that is just that's built in after the fact. But yeah, I liked Revenge of the Sith. I think that if Lucas had have found out his script to someone else after he'd written it, just to clean up the dialogue,
Mhm.
again, it's that dialogue that makes it suffer a lot.
Exactly.
You know, but from a story standpoint, the plotting of it, it's all really well handled. It's just, again, some pretty mucky dialogue, and George Lucas isn't the best at getting the best performances out of his actors. But beyond that, it was just an incredible ride. And I remember
Exactly.
going when I went to see it for the first time. We went to it opening night, and we all went in fancy dress. And I remember a friend of mine, he was dressed as the Death Star. we we spent the day making this massive paper mache Death Star around him, and yeah, we went to this screening with him dressed as a Death Star. But yeah, that's my fond memories of it. But no, it was just, I just remember it just felt like constant action from start to finish.
Yeah.
But the action seemed to be led by the story, which obviously is always going to be the best way to do action. It's
Yeah.
just dialogue could have done with being a bit cleaner. But no, like I say, I wasn't the biggest Star Wars fan. The prequel trilogy didn't make me any more so. I just thought, all right, that's the films. Great. I like a couple of them. I like a couple of them quite a bit. I like a couple more, a reasonable amount, and two of them not so much.
Right. So let's get into the fifth question, and that is, then we had this big gap between 2005 and 2015.
Mm.
So even though you clearly weren't the Star Wars fanatic, I mean, I would definitely say that I was a little bit more of a fan, but not a fanatic either. Did you try to get into any of the books, or did you watch any of the animated series that came out, like Clone Wars or Star Wars Rebels? Did you play any of the video games? And how did you feel when you heard that Disney got the property?
I've never been a particularly big computer game player, so the answer to that question is kind of no.
I
Although
didn't play them either.
yeah, I did have a bit of a run on the Star Wars Lego at my friend's house. The same friend who'd lent me the Star Wars movies when I was 15. Yeah, did a bit of a run on the Star Wars Lego game, but that was kind of a whatever moment. I did watch some of the Clone Wars series. That was after watching the movie.
Yeah, I saw that too. Yeah, the
Yeah,
animated movie,
so
which is really
yeah,
the pilot of the show.
yeah, it's not great. But yeah, I I thought some of the episodes that I'd watched were okay. They were entertaining enough, but I felt like it was more geared towards the fanatic than the casual fan. Like I reckon there's a lot of moments in that series that if you are a fanatic, it's going to be like, oh.
Yeah, I had a few of those moments, not gonna lie. I had a few of those
Mm,
moments, just
yeah,
seeing
yeah.
certain characters. And,
Mm,
you know, for me, I did read three of the books. There were these three Hugo Award-winning books by an author named Timothy Zahn, and they are Heir to the Empire, Dark Forces Rising, and The Last Command. The reason why I wanted to read those books was because those were George Lucas himself said that if he was ever going to make episodes 7, 8, 9, this is where the source material would come from. I mean, this is where one of those extended universe characters that everybody loves was introduced, and that was Mara Jade, and then there was Grand Admiral Thrawn, who was in the Star Wars Rebels cartoon, which has ended up being one of my personal favorite characters in all of Star Wars. It was also the first time that Coruscant was ever created, and George Lucas took that idea and brought it to the big screen, because some of my favorite parts of Star Wars is Coruscant. I just love the concept of a planet that's one gigantic city. I love that. Someone who walks around the streets of New York like they're saying, wow, if all of New York was an entire planet, how cool would that be? You know?
It's my idea of hell.
Yeah, it would be terrible. But no, I mean, like, I love the theme parks. I didn't get versed into that many more of the books or the comics. I just owned those 3 specific books. I was someone who really liked to see what goes on in between the movie stories. Like, that's why I liked Clone Wars, because, you know, Attack of the Clones starts off with the beginning of the Clone Wars, and episode 3 is where the Clone Wars end. But I'm like, what happens in between? I'm just curious. You know, I'd like to see what happens with Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker and Mace Windu. I think the character Ahsoka Tano is a great character. She's got a lot of layers to her. I like that. And Star Wars Rebels was interesting to me because of the fact, like, you know, now I want to see what happens in between episodes parts 3 and 4. And they definitely pulled a lot from some of the comics. Like, there's a whole story with Darth Maul, because he didn't die, apparently. And it was cool to see that story. But for me, when they announced that George Lucas was selling the property to Disney, I gotta be honest with you, I smelled trouble. I did.
I had 2 gut reactions to that. My first gut reaction was awesome.
Okay.
You know, like, as much as people rag on Disney, they know what they're doing, you know, like, they, whichever way you cut it, they make some of the most successful movies of all time.
Mhm.
You know, I love what they've done with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Yeah,
Me too.
so comparing what they've done with the MCU and a lot of their animated stuff with what Lucas did with Star Wars, because let's not try and gloss over the fact that during the 90s, Star Wars fans, and I'm talking the fanatics, not just the fans, were really cursing Lucas out for having cocked up his own creation.
Of course.
You know, nowadays they've done an about turn, and they're like, oh, Lucas is God and he needs to come back and take over the property and stuff like that. But yeah, you know, Revenge, what we've just said about Revenge of Sith aside, overall that prequel trilogy didn't give me the greatest faith in Lucas as a filmmaker and the direction he might take it if he carried on with it. So yeah, put it in the hands of a studio that's got the money, something with it. Great stuff. My second gut reaction was that, crap, this is the start of Disney taking over the world.
Becoming the actual evil empire.
Yes, which really isn't a good thing. Like, as much as I like their product for the most part, that doesn't mean I want every film to be the
be a
same.
Disney film.
To be a Disney film, to have that same flavor. You know, it's one of the things that it's one of the things I like about DC movies, is that, you know, not every comic book movie has to be a Marvel movie. I love Marvel movies. Love them. I own them all. I watch them constantly. I think they're great. But I don't want that to be every comic book movie I ever see. You know, I want there to be room for something like The Crow, or something like, you know, well, even Blade, which obviously is a Marvel movie,
the Carl Urban Dread.
Yeah. You know,
hopefully,
so, Batman v Superman.
And God willing, somewhere down the line, a really good Dark Spawn movie with Todd McFarlane really taking control of that. I'd love to see that.
We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
I don't have much faith in him, to be honest, as a filmmaker.
But anyway, yeah.
So yeah. So for me, I just, variety is the spice of life. You know, having dark DC and light Marvel, I'm fine with that. So when suddenly Disney is buying up studios left, right, and center, like they own Alien now, they own
That's
Predator.
scary.
You
That's
know,
very
it's
scary.
just these franchises which are horror, are dark, are twisted, are, I don't want them Disneyfying. I don't want them MCUing. You
But
know,
that's the scary part. This is what gets a little bit more interesting. You also have to remember all the studios that Disney has had for years. Remember, Disney is responsible for Kevin Smith's View universe thanks to Miramax, and the same can be said about some of Quentin Tarantino's films. Disney made Pulp Fiction. Miramax. Disney had Touchstone. They're responsible for Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So the real question is, they've given us movies that are for mature audiences already. Why do they want to scale back?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's get into the sixth question, and that is, now that Disney's got the property, and I'm sure you will have your piece to say, let's talk about the sequel trilogy. Because obviously, you know, I was excited to see more Star Wars films in 3D, and then they say, nope, we got the property now. Disney says, we're going to make episodes 7, 8, and 9. And I'm just like saying to myself, please, please take the Timothy Zahn trilogy and give me these movies. Give me these great 7, 8, and 9 episodes. Age the characters if you have to, but just give me this amazing story like George Lucas was proud of calling episodes 7, 8, and 9. But they didn't. And they gave us something different.
Yeah, I couldn't give a crap about them giving us something George Lucas would be proud of, to be honest, because, well, I've already stated I'm not the biggest proponent of Lucas as the primary storyteller anyway. So I will say this: when the Force Awakens came out, I was reasonably excited by it because I liked Abrams as a director. I liked what he did with Star Trek. I thought if he could bring that to Star Wars, should be good. I love Force Awakens. For me personally, it is the best Star Wars film. I know that many people hate anyone like me who would even suggest that The Force Awakens is the best Star Wars film, and would simply cry at me why it's just a remake of Episode 4. Yes,
Technically.
while that may be slightly true, it still does everything better.
There you go.
Most importantly, the things that happen in it have emotional weight to them that for me, Episode 4 just didn't have. Now, I've already talked about this already. Episode 4 plotting great, but when you have Leia who sees her home planet getting destroyed and then decides in the next scene that we see her in to make a wisecrack at Luke, rather than being in a deep depression about her whole people being wiped out, that to me is not the correct emotional way of handling things. Whereas what Abrams brings to The Force Awakens is weight to the things that happen. There are emotional ramifications for people's actions. I also think that Kylo Ren is a much more interesting and intriguing villain than Darth Vader ever was. And people, again, will attack me for that. Oh, Vader's the classic villain. Until the last of Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader is not a character. Okay? He is not a character. He is a Marvel villain, a typical Marvel villain. He's just somebody who wants to dominate the universe, and that is it. Until we find out that nugget of information right at the end of Empire, he is not a character. So if we hadn't have got an empire, right? If we'd have just had that first Star Wars film and it wasn't that successful, so that's all we got. There's no character there. He's just a world dominator. There's nothing there. We get more character development with Kylo Ren in the first 20 minutes than we ever did with Vader in the first two films. So for me, he's a much more interesting villain. Emotionally, I'm more invested in than I ever was with Vader. So, okay, plot beats, very similar to 4, but it is not the same film. It is very far from being the same film, and that is because Abrams deals much better with character and story beats. He makes the film a much more emotional ride, and of course, with the update of technology and things, he's able to achieve a lot more with the action scenes. Now, I know that's not Lucas's fault. Obviously, that's just the time in which he made his films, so I'm not going to hold that against him. But either way you cut it, you mix the modern technology with someone who knows how to tell a story much better, knows how to handle character development much better, how to draw emotional responses from the audience much better. Then for me, that is the better film, and I will stand by that till the cows come home. Yeah, Force Awakens for me made me a fan. It made me want to go back and watch the other films, even the ones that in my mind, I didn't like them. I really didn't like them, and yet I still want to go and watch them because now, having seen the Force Awakens, I'm like, that is awesome. I love this world and I love these characters. So yeah, Last Jedi, a film that I personally think is one of the most underrated movies I've ever seen. It's just Ryan Johnson is a great filmmaker, and all the hashtag not my Luke nonsense. Grow up. You're not telling the story. Someone else is, and it's someone who knows again how to tell a story. You got 30 years. A lot can happen in 30 years to a character, you know. You look at C.S. Lewis. He was an ardent Christian, you know, a man of God who rejected his faith and went off and decided he no longer believed in God for a fair few years before coming back to his faith again. Well, is that not the journey that Luke goes on in Last Jedi? People saying, "Oh, not my Luke. He wouldn't do that. Why would he turn his back on like that?" People do it. That happens in the space of a 30-year span. That happens. People change. People have dark moments, dark periods. Stuff happens that shapes and reshapes their way of thinking and their outlook on life. That happened to Luke. To me, it was much more believable. It was much more engrossing than coming back and finding this superhero. You know, our heroes, the people we worship, aren't always the gods we've turned them into. And it's just like, I don't know. For me, I thought there's a lot going on in that film. A lot of places Johnson took it that were interesting, that were really good storytelling. Was it perfect? No. There's a lot of scenes in there. A lot of the stuff with Rose I felt was just meandering. I could have done without it. The casino stuff where they go in, it's just something to cut to when you need to bridge a gap between the stuff that's going on with Rey and Luke. So no, it's not perfect, but everything other than those bits is just top notch, really top notch stuff. So yeah, I loved that, and it got me excited for the final film, which was going to bring all those elements together in a great climax. But what happened? The fans, that's what happened. The fanatics, they cocked it up because of their ridiculous outcry and their constant complaining and their stream of absolute hatred for the past 2-3 years via the internet. It backed Disney into a corner. It backed Abrams into a corner where they felt they had to right the wrongs that Ryan Johnson had made. he hadn't made any wrongs. It's just he took the story in a direction that some people didn't like, idiots didn't like, and rather than seeing that through, rather than carrying on with those threads, the last film rejects, glosses over Johnson's film so that it almost becomes insignificant.
No, I want you to finish, but I'm definitely going to talk about that when it gets to my turn.
Mm-hmm. Don't get me wrong, I don't dislike it. Good movie. It's still an emotional ride in places. It's still great action. I was a little disappointed. It's got to be said, because of the ride that I had with The Force Awakens and the different places that Johnson took the story, unexpected places, with a film that I felt like it had something to say. It really felt like it was exploring certain issues, and if you look at the film as a religious allegory, it's almost like a callback to the Old Testament, the Israelites, the promises of God, and the Holy Spirit and things like that, and almost like moving into New Testament times in which it's opened up to everyone. It's just there's a lot of religious allegory in there, which I find very interesting that Johnson explored, and I just feel like a lot of that is dispensed with. Not because Abrams is a bad storyteller, not because not because he wouldn't have made a great film if he'd have had the time and whatever that he wanted, but because the studio felt we've got to do some damage control. So rather than committing to the plot that they'd given us in Last Jedi, they spend so much time at the start of Rise of Skywalker. The name completely escaped me for a moment there. They spend so much time at the beginning of that film trying to smooth over those edges, trying to get rid of Last Jedi, essentially. That by the time we get into stuff, I'm not as invested anymore. So by the time they're introducing new characters, halfway Rise of Skywalker, I'm like, I don't care about these people. These people shouldn't be part of this story. We've got characters. Okay, Rose is not a character I was particularly warm to in Last Jedi, but surely she is a character that is much more worthy of being brought to the front, to the fore, to do stuff towards the end of Rise of Skywalker, rather than bringing in this new character halfway through the film and then expecting us to embrace her and her heroics and whatnot. And it's like, it just, I felt like it spat in the face of Rian Johnson. I felt like they did too much to gloss over what he'd done and almost wipe it out. And I just felt like the movie was a bit too cluttered as a result of that. Right. So it was an enjoyable ride. I enjoyed it. It was fun. There was a few nice emotional beats in there, but for me, it was just a bit too cluttered, and a bit unsatisfying.
Right. So for me, when it comes to these new films, and also if I were to talk about all the Star Wars films that came out when Disney officially took over it, I personally feel that out of all of them, my favorite is Rogue One. I think that movie is so good. And just because of the fact that it really gives us like a truly great war movie. And I also really thought it was cool to see that whole story about getting the plans for the first Death Star. I love that. I love the actors in it, etc. But, after seeing these three films, it was really two things for me. One was the fact that I had seen so many other films up until this point, and I had truly become a film appreciator where Star Wars really isn't the greatest thing since sliced bread. And also the fans just really being so critical over these movies, particularly Episode 8. Part of me wishes that these three films were never, ever made in the first place. Now, when I went to see The Force Awakens, yeah, amazing. I had such a good time. It was the only time I actually saw a Star Wars film in this new era multiple times in theaters outside of Rogue One. I saw The Force Awakens twice just because I had so much fun with it. I thought that J.J. Abrams would be able to do something great, give me a great, fun space epic. Seeing Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher back was such a great thing to see. But after I saw that movie, and then when the fans, again, this is another thing I blame the internet and the fans, they were really starting to nitpick, and they were saying, oh, look at this happened in episode 4, and this was basically it was episode 4 told all over again. And like my overall feelings about Star Wars, I'm like, oh no, like what's gonna happen now? And then The Last Jedi comes out. And this is before everything just went to pot. I walked out of that movie thinking it was okay. One of the few things that these three films do give me, though, great acting and great chemistry between characters. But the problem for me with The Last Jedi, outside of the political messages that I personally saw in this film, my attitude about the movie was I didn't like the fact that, at least in my eyes, the plot didn't go anywhere. I just felt that we started off in one place, and then we ended in a spot that was basically saying, well, where did we just go? Like, nothing happened. That was my attitude. I did like Luke's story. I loved the concept of the fallen hero, and I understood the reason why Luke could be a fallen hero. It made perfect sense to me. And Mark Hamill did a great job as Luke. But I agree with you. I think that the Canto Bight scenes, if they would have just not had them in the movie, and they wouldn't have played up Rose so much, especially in that scene where we all thought that Finn was going to be sacrificing his life, and she basically steps in and saves him. Honestly, I wanted Finn to die in that scene because I felt that they just destroyed whatever potential he had. That was another thing I didn't like about The Last Jedi. I felt the characters that J.J. Abrams introduced us to didn't really get much development that we wanted from Rian Johnson. Now, maybe that's just me. Maybe it's me just being a fan, but I really felt that this movie could have been a lot more. I'm not saying that it was bad, but there were definitely a lot of things that just left me feeling unsatisfied. It was the very first time where I walked out of a Star Wars movie and I turned to everybody that I was with and I was like, I don't want to see that again in theaters. I'm just going to wait for DVD. And all the stuff that happened between 2017 and 2019 just was sad. I tried not to get involved, but part of me just needed to hear what people were saying for a good laugh. And everything that was being talked about in regards to The Rise of Skywalker, I was just like saying, oh my God, this is going to probably end up being one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. Now, I don't think that Rise of Skywalker sweeps The Last Jedi away. As a matter of fact, I feel that it gives The Last Jedi its rightful place in the story. Because of what happens with Luke and because of what happens with the whole thing with Rey, I feel that it made perfect sense what J.J. Abrams did with the fact that Rey's true origins were quote-unquote hidden for the sake of making sure that she was not going to be found. I thought that that was a good idea. And honestly, because of the events of The Rise of Skywalker, everything to me in The Last Jedi just makes more sense. But the problem with The Rise of Skywalker is, like you said, to be putting it bluntly, it's a desperate cry for help. Because Disney realizes now, did they have to worry about the fans? No, they didn't. But obviously, who's going to go see these Star Wars movies? Who's going to give them money for Star Wars? It's the fans. I mean, thank goodness they didn't do anything to botch up the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because if two franchises had gone awry and the fans were in an upheaval, things would be really, really bad for Disney. But I saw The Rise of Skywalker. I had a good time with it, but I'm looking at it, I'm like, no, this is just a desperate cry for help. They're just trying to do it all for fan service, minus a couple of the positives that I saw. However, I really thought that after I walked out of Rise of Skywalker, I would take my copies of The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi and throw them in the trash and say, this does not exist to me. No. The Rise of Skywalker allows this trilogy to be a part of Star Wars. I watched The Last Jedi again when I actually bought it on DVD. I bought it for $8 because I didn't want to pay full price, but I still wanted to own it, being the completionist that I am. However, the only two Star Wars movies I don't own is Clone Wars and Solo: A Star Wars Story. That hype just died for me with Solo. It was fun, but not great. But I feel that when I saw The Last Jedi again, I didn't think it was as bad as I felt when I actually walked out of that movie. There is great stuff in it, but my issue with this trilogy as a whole is I, at this point in time, wish that it was never made, because I feel that what Star Wars was, it's not that anymore. But personally, being older and seeing a lot of great movies, it was starting not to be what it was anymore for me. But that's just how I feel about these new movies. I think that they're good. I just don't think that they're truly what everything else that was Star Wars, to me at least, was. I feel that it could have been better.
I just think The Last Jedi, it deals with this issue of the religious nature of what the Jedi had become. Again, looking at it as a biblical allegory, Jesus comes and he shows the religiousness of the Pharisees and whatnot, and there's a parable that he tells about God's having this, throwing this party and sending out these invitations to the guests, which we as a Christian, and we read that and we say, well, that's the Jews being the chosen people. But for religiosity being the thing that truly destroyed the Jedi, and the thing that is going to build the Jedi back up isn't religion, but rather faith. Is this listening to the Force, or if you want to speak about it in more religious terms, the Holy Spirit. So letting the Spirit be your guide, rather than it being about following certain rules and having to be a certain way because you're a Jedi and because the Jedi have such a respect amongst the galaxy. And with that, and that's why I thought it was to make Luke the character that he had become in this film, to show that actually it's not about him. It's not about his greatness and his skills as a Jedi, and it's about the Force. It's not Luke that's important. It's not the Skywalkers that's important. It's the Force that is important. It's the Force working through anyone who chooses to listen to it. And for me, that's the allegory that is there, and it's just beautifully handled when you look at it in those terms. So when you have this ending in The Last Jedi, where you see this person on, you know, see these people on the planet, and they're just nobodies. They're nobodies, but they're the next Jedi. Is what the film's saying. That
Yeah.
these nobodies, that, you know, they're the next Jedi. That because what they're doing is they're listening to the Force. They've got a natural rhythm with the Force, in the same way that people can stop and listen to God. And so it was that element to me that was the most interesting and the most subtle. So the idea of Rey being a nobody, you know, her parents, they ran off, they left her, that's it. There's no great story. She's not the one, which every story does. You know, we always go back to that, you know, the one. So in the end, you know, when we come back to the Rise of Skywalker, we have to make her the one. And it's just, no, I liked what Johnson did. And to me, he was having a real good discussion about bigger, more weightier themes, which I just feel got lost on most people. And to me, I would have liked to have seen that explored more. This idea of people who are coming from, you know, not high society, but the lowest of society, suddenly rising up and becoming Jedi because they're listening to the Force. They're in tune with the Force, and just that idea of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not about this great hero Luke. It's not about the Skywalkers, but ultimately it's about the Force, and that it was always about the Force. And that to me is the direction it should have gone in. And I feel that's kind of, I see that trajectory from The Last Jedi. Whether that's where Johnson would have taken it if he'd have done the third film, I don't know. But to me, that would have been the area more worth exploring. But instead, what I think we get is something that relies far too heavily on more traditional forms of storytelling, which is that ultimately we have to bring it back to the lone hero, the one, you know, the chosen one, and that kind of flies in the face of everything that The Last Jedi set up.
So now the question is remaining with the last question that we'll have today. And now that what is called the Skywalker saga is complete, you know, for better or for worse, what do you feel the future of this franchise will be? And especially that in 2027, we're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the original Star Wars film. What do you think is going to happen to these films? But before you get into that, let me just say my piece. Personally, I'm going to say what I said when I reviewed The Rise of Skywalker. Because of everything that happened over the last few years with these films, I just think that what needs to happen is Star Wars needs to be forgotten for just a little while. It's a pity that in 7 years, the 50th anniversary will be celebrated, but, you know, think about it this way. When Return of the Jedi came out in 1983, we didn't get another Star Wars movie for over a decade. And I feel that that's something that needs to happen now. I feel that especially these new movies, they need to be just put on a shelf or just locked in a vault somewhere, let them age a little bit, let them gather a little bit of dust, and then rewatch them. Because I think what's kind of funny is people who watch these new movies were actually starting to say that and I'm not one of them, I want to make that clear, but there were some people that were saying that these new movies make Attack of the Clones and The Phantom Menace look like Gone with the Wind and Lawrence of Arabia in respect. Now, I didn't agree with that statement. I always liked those three movies. I did. But I just think right now that Disney has to stop milking this cow right now. Not forever, but right now. I know that The Mandalorian is a great show. I haven't watched it, but I hear great things. The fact that Clone Wars is actually going to continue, and rightfully so, it didn't have to end where it did. It only ended because of the fact that the company that was making it lost the rights and Disney got the franchise. So they unfortunately had to stop the show. I feel that maybe they need to put other people in charge. Maybe Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau need to officially take over the ship if they want to start making more new content. The fact that the Kenobi story starring Ewan McGregor is very much alive and well. But I truthfully feel that, they're just milking it right now, and they got to stop because, look, another beloved franchise is dealing with this exact same problem. Not as much as Star Wars, but Harry Potter is now getting a ton of flack from the fans. And why? Because when J.K. Rowling wrote that last book and that last movie was made, she wanted it to be over. But the fans said, no, 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 we want more. And when you get more, you don't like what you get. That's not the creator's fault. That's your fault. I personally didn't think we needed more Star Wars movies, but we got them. So I'm not saying that I'm part of the problem or I'm not part of the problem, but my opinion is we need to make room for other things right now. Star Wars right now is unfortunately in trouble. Whether you people want to deny it or not, it's in trouble. And I feel the only way to get it out of trouble right now is to just stop trying to fix it. That's what I feel about it right here and the now. We should revisit it, but not now.
Yeah, I disagree.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is stop using the characters we know and start giving us new ones. Star Wars, man, it's just, it's huge. We've got whole planets out there that we've never even touched on. You can do absolutely anything.
But they
Okay?
have.
So the key is not to stop making the movies. It's to start saying, right, what we're going to do is we're going to find great filmmakers, auteurs, Sam Mendes, people like that, and we're going to say, do a film in the Star Wars universe. Take control. Do your thing. Do whatever you want to do. Do a film, a solo film that isn't tied into the Skywalker. So, because that's the problem with Solo. Now, personally, I really liked Solo.
It was good. It was fun. It was a fun movie.
I really enjoyed it. But the problem with it is that it's a prequel. So it's giving us stuff that leads to other stuff we already know. So with that comes certain trappings, certain failings, certain, you just set yourself up to fail already because there's already a built-in expectation of, people envision, they have their own kind of thoughts about who Han Solo was back in the day. So you're never going to fulfill that because people have already got that built up in their minds. What we need is new Star Wars movies that are solo movies, not tied into a bigger universe other than, we know this is a Star Wars movie because it has certain ships, certain weapons, certain dress codes, whatever. We know that it's Star Wars, but just give us new characters. They can do anything. They can literally go anywhere. Just give us new characters, new stories, make them solo, make them contained, and then we'll end up with more stuff that people can really get behind rather than stuff that's, because it's so tied in with the overarching Skywalker story, unless it's perfect, unless it meets the requirements of what people have in their minds, then it's always going to fail. And I've seen the first 2 episodes of The Mandalorian, and it is really great. And based, I mean, I don't know where it goes. Obviously, I've only seen the first two, but those first two are not, they're not tied to Skywalker or
Yeah.
Solo or any of these characters who are in it. It's a completely new character that we're following, and we're in his journey. But we know it's Star Wars because the dude dresses like Boba Fett, so we know he comes from a particular group of people, does a particular kind of job. That's enough. That's all we need to know. Now give us a story with this guy and let us get to know him. So for me, that's what they need to do. Give us movies, standalone movies, but give them to proper filmmakers, proper storytellers. They did that with Bond. They gave Sam Mendes Bond. He gave us Skyfall, which is quite possibly the best Bond film ever made. And they said it's not just a Bond film; it's a Sam Mendes film. It's got his stamp all over it as a filmmaker. It's just that's what they want to do, and they want to do it with Star Wars. And to me, that's where the future lies.
I mean, my issue was the fact that, when they decided to make these three films, they basically said that everything that comes after The Last Jedi is no longer canon. Now, there's a lot of stuff in the books and in the comic books that didn't necessarily revolve around the original cast of characters. There were other characters. I would have loved to see characters like Mara Jade in a Star Wars movie. I feel that there's potential there. I also wouldn't mind if they went back in time and gave us those rumored Knights of the Old Republic, which has nothing to do with the Skywalker story. It's actually more of the Jedi lore. There's a whole comic series about the Sith uprising and the Sith Wars. I would love to see that whole thing take place. There is potential. I agree with you. But the problem is right now, when someone who is a true Star Wars fan, not a casual fan like yourself or someone even like me, when someone hears Star Wars, someone throws up in their mouth a little bit because they're just sick of it. That's, I think, the other issue.
But that's not going to go. That's not going to go with it. You give a 10-year gap. You're not going to get rid of that. It'll come back as if it never went away, because we've had it. We had it during the prequels. When the prequels came out, internet was just really getting going. We were starting to get people doing online blogs and things like that, and it's just like, we had that in the prequels, and we heard such an outcry and an uproar about how Lucas had raped people's childhoods by destroying the franchise he'd created. So it's nothing new.
No.
And simply putting Star Wars on the shelf for 10 years ain't going to get rid of that. What's going to get rid of that is making good movies.
Exactly. Which is still something that a lot of major movie studios, Disney included, needs to understand. Stop trying to make movies for the sake of making money and make movies for the sake of making good movies.
Look at DC, right? Look at DC.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of years ago, they were a laughing stock. People were, you got Justice League, a film that quite frankly should have broken box office records, barely even made a dent. It's just, they cocked things up. They made a lot of mistakes. They screwed Zack Snyder over and didn't trust in their director's vision. They didn't allow the filmmaker they'd entrusted the stuff with to do what he would signed on to do, and they went as a result of that, they went all over the place. We ended up with Suicide Squad, which was just a mess, and by that point they were a laughing stock. People were like, DC are done, they're over, and they had some real work cut out for them. You look at them now; they're proper contenders now. They're not a laughing stock anymore. They gave us Wonder Woman, which was a surefire hit. Aquaman, really great world building. Mm-hmm. Shazam, really good comedy film. And then flipping heck, Joker. It's just been nominated for Best Picture, as well as tons of other awards, because they're not making every film fit the same template. You look at the collection of films they've put out in recent years, and there is a different flavor to each of them. And that's because they're giving filmmakers their due. They're saying, okay, we want the filmmaker to come in and make their film within our world, but their film.
Yeah. And
And you don't always get that with Marvel. You look at Marvel movies, and yeah, okay, they've got some of these really good filmmakers, but quite frankly, you look at, and the films are great, but they all have the same style. They all have
yeah,
a certain flavor
it's
about them that could very well be the same filmmaker behind each of them.
it's the reason why you can't let the studio really be involved. It's the reason why Edgar Wright walked away from Ant-Man. It's the reason why Scott Derrickson just packed his bags and left Doctor Strange into the multiverse of madness. The one Marvel movie in Phase 4 that the fans were extremely excited for the most, because he was saying, we're going to make a horror movie for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and Kevin Feige immediately steps in and goes, it's not going to be what you think it is. So you're right. The fact that DC originally stepped in and didn't want the visionaries to do their work, I mean, honestly, Birds of Prey to me looks terrible. I have no desire to see that movie at all. Now, if people go to see it and say this is better than what you think it is, then maybe I'll give it a shot. But right now, no. I have no chance in hell of seeing that movie. Wonder Woman 1984, on the other hand, I'm excited for. I'm very excited for that one. And Black Widow. I'm also very happy to see that the two most anticipated movies of 2020 in the world of science fiction and fantasy are two female-driven comic book character movies. I'm really excited to actually see these two specific heroes because, look, Black Widow deserves her solo movie. She's such a good character. I really want to see her character unfold. And I love Wonder Woman. It was a great film. I knew it was going to be a great film. Patty Jenkins did a stellar job. But I agree. They need to stop worrying about how much money we can make, because what I was going to say was, did we really need Toy Story 4? We only got Toy Story 4 because Disney needed money. That's the way that I look at it. I'm glad that
they don't need money. They want money.
I'm glad. Well, they hate when they lose money, but the fact that they actually were able to make it work was a shock to me. But as I always say, if that movie was never made, I would never have lost sleep over it. I want original stories, new characters, new adventures, just like you, or new adapted screenplays from things that we've never seen before, Yeah. But anyway, I think that's going to wrap it up, Brian. I actually am so happy with the way this conversation unfolded, because it was exactly what I was hoping to get, to be honest with you. I'm really glad that we got what we got. And I'm really hoping that you all enjoyed this first Sunday Sit Down of 2020. Comments in the box below. Let's chat a little bit. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all in the next episode of Sunday Sit Down, where we will have another great topic. But most importantly, as always, another great YouTuber to discuss it with. See you all soon. Hey, thank you so much for stopping by my channel today. If you're new here and want to see more of what my channel has to offer, please click on the link to my last video, or hit that subscribe button to be kept up to date with all of my uploads. Content of all sorts is posted here quite often, so trust me, you do not want to fall behind. I will see you in the comments, and actions speak louder than words.